It's shortly after 4 o'clock on the evening of Friday, 23rd of November, and I'm here outside Southwark Crown Court. It's the end of 5 days of proceedings of the Newton hearing for David and his former wife, Lorraine Noakes. And unfortunately for me, because I'm not going to be here, but the case will continue into Monday and Tuesday. Now, this morning, David was back on the stand, and this was the opportunity for his barrister to give him the opportunity to walk through some of the issues arising from his cross-examination. And perhaps the crucial moment here was when David was asked by the judge at the end of that part of the proceedings whether or not he, knowing what he knows now, would basically break the law to produce and distribute GcMAF. And David didn't really take much time to think about it, but he said, is it worth breaking the law to save lives? Absolutely, Your Honour. And of course the prosecution have tried to turn that against him on the basis that they claim it shows David's flagrant disregard for the law. A very grey area, because if a law is inappropriate, if a law is not in the best interests of humanity, then it is, of course, absolutely and fundamentally right that it is challenged. Of course, the establishment, the corporatocracy, and the judiciary do not want their authority undermined. But, there are occasions when it is extremely appropriate for the law to be challenged. And, much has been made of the fact that this isn't a court of morality. It is a court of law. But let's make it very clear that our whole legal system, a little over 140 years ago, was acknowledged as the undoing of God's law. In other words, putting a raft of statutes in above common law. And of course, common law has the premise of thou shalt do no harm. But one might argue, and certainly David has made it very clear that it is his point of view, that the MHRA and Big Pharma are actually in the business of doing harm, whilst pretending to be in the business of healing. And, it's the classic magician's trick. Well, believe this, because actually what's going on is really going on behind your back. So then, as we got to lunch, and basically this afternoon was the opportunity for the prosecution to make their case, to summarise their case, for the benefit of the judge, to help him determine the appropriate sentence. And of course the defence team have the opportunity to respond. And first up was Lorraine Noakes' legal team, and much of their argument really their response to the prosecution case is that she knowingly participated in criminal activity. And the defence case is, well, actually, yes, she might have done, but how much did she really know? And, her motivation wasn't the criminal activity. Her motivation was actually getting her life back. And she saw this as an opportunity to have gainful employment and actually have some degree of financial independence. And I think the judge has a difficult decision on this basis. The prosecution are clearly wanting a custodial sentence, but I think that perhaps some degree of humanity will kick in here, and as was requested by the defence, that the judge will give due consideration to a suspended sentence and allow Lorraine Noakes to get back on with her life. So then the prosecution, of course, started to make their case against David, or summarise their case against David. And what is interesting is, once again, nobody wants to go anywhere near the issue of the efficacy of GcMAF, because I think there is the realization that this opens a whole can of worms. So although there are attempts to effectively claim that even if it has efficacy, David, not being a medical or pharmaceutical professional, can't really have known that, even though the evidence has been presented about his reliance on scientific papers, his work with scientists, particularly at the University of Florence, and with medical practitioners around the world, not least Dr. Bradstreet, who once again it was acknowledged that he was sadly murdered, although the official story is committed suicide, when he was found with a gunshot wound in his chest in the middle of a river in the Carolinas one day after his labs were raided in the US. So very interesting, and I think this is something that we'll hear more about, the fact that the efficacy of GcMAF is not being questioned. And I think that this does open up this whole issue of what really is the role of Big Pharma and of the MHRA when a healthcare product with an accepted and, one might argue, established efficacy is deliberately kept off the market. And David made the observation that the MHRA should have been biting his arm off and saying, my goodness me, this is amazing, how can we help you bring this to market, rather than simply trying to shut him down. So the prosecution's case is that actually David really wasn't that altruistic. What he actually saw was an opportunity to make a shed load of money and live life high on the hog. And as I intimated yesterday, David perhaps didn't help his case when trying to justify some £800,000 worth of expenditure on a six-seater executive jet, which turned out to be a total dog anyway, because the fuel consumption was so excessive that it just wasn't a viable proposition, and then he wasn't able to sell it. And of course, that coupled with the fact that he bought, I think it was a 4-year-old Aston Martin and a 16-year-old Rolls Royce and a £46,000 yacht. So of course, the prosecution make big play on that and say, look, he was just trying to live life high on the hog, whilst actually trying to play down the amounts that he did invest in the labs and in the the manufacturing process, in the sterility tests. And although with the benefit of hindsight, he accepts that perhaps he could have done things better, at the end of the day, I think my gut feel is that his motivation primarily was altruistic, and the fact that there was an opportunity to have a pretty nice lifestyle on the back of it, well, show me a chief executive that doesn't take advantage of that. And as he threw into the discussion, his total revenue was barely that of the annual compensation package of a chief executive of a big pharmaceutical company. And of course that's exactly what they're trying to protect. So the prosecution case was that although David states that he wanted to get the product into the NHS, once he realized that the only way he could do that was to get a license, and then he was doing everything he could to effectively get a license on the cheap. And again, much comes around to the debate as to, well, was the motivation simply to get into the NHS? Because obviously, as any pharmaceutical company will tell you, that's the real gravy train. That's when the, it's effectively a license to print money. Well, one might argue that if that was truly his motivation, then he would have probably thrown everything he could at getting a license. But I think that he articulates the case that the likelihood of that happening was slim to none, because the MHRA, which he makes very clear he holds in absolute disdain, would effectively do everything to make sure he was never able to bring that product to market. So what was the key driver? Was the key driver the desire to actually help people, to relieve people's suffering, or was the driver to make a shed load of money and live life high on the hog? And as the judge acknowledges, life is never simple. And I doubt very much whether any chief executive of any company, or even any senior executive of any company, doesn't expect feel it's appropriate to get due reward in return for their efforts. And so this is obviously where the judge has to make some balance. So over the course of the weekend, David's defence team have the opportunity to prepare their final mitigation submission to the judge before the judge actually passes sentence. And where it stands right now is, I think David's legal team fully expect him to be getting or receiving a custodial sentence when the judge sentences, probably on Tuesday morning. But, his defence team have the whole weekend to prepare a response. And this is quite unusual, because quite often that has to be done literally overnight. So, this is the acid test. Will David's legal team step up to the plate? Will they show what they are truly capable of and convince the judge that actually, for multiple reasons, not least the fact that David and Lorraine and others involved have been through absolute purgatory 3.5 years. They've effectively had their lives, they might as well have been in prison, because they've basically had their passports confiscated. They've been restricted in terms of their movements. They've had to report to the police every Monday at 10 o'clock. They've had bank accounts frozen. They've been totally dependent on the generosity of family and friends for 3.5 years. And I say, it could be argued that, had justice been seen to be done in a more timely fashion, then, they would have been through this process, would have been tried, would have served whatever sentence was determined, and got on with their lives. So, this is actually a form of torture by keeping people in this state of abeyance for so long. And hopefully this is, amongst other things, something that David's defence team will put forward to the judge. And, then we'll have to see, how things unfold from there. Of course, the MHRA are in court. They are monitoring things, and clearly they want to get the message out that anyone who thinks that they can bring a product, especially an effective product, to market, needs to understand that they will be very disappointed, and they will literally be cleaned out one way or another, and they will never be able to challenge the monopoly of the pharmaceutical industry. And the MHRA is effectively a government department sponsored by Big Pharma. And, as I said this morning, in reality, and perhaps this is the opportunity, because this case is certainly getting a lot more attention than maybe the establishment might like. And, one of the things that we absolutely have to look at is ways in which those who deliberately prevent effective medicines from coming to market are held to account, and they do answer to the charge of a crime against humanity, because that's precisely what it is. And as more and more people become aware of what's occurring here, as more and more people experience cancer either for themselves or within their family, then maybe they'll look back at what's occurring here and realize that the only way in which this gets changed is if we, the collective we, actually challenge the establishment. Because obviously what they want is they want people just to basically acquiesce to their laws and just to be locked into debt slavery and not have the time, even if they have the inclination, to bring about the changes that we all know we need to see. I have to say that in the scheme of things, I feel that Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith has handled the case extremely well, with balance, and of course his hands are to some extent tied. There is perhaps limited flexibility in terms of what he can do regarding the sentencing, but I think that Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith knows very well that, whilst there may be some justification in the prosecution case that David was looking, to live a nice lifestyle out of it, but that doesn't make him any difference from anybody else who is either heading up a corporation or enters into the entrepreneurial spirit and seeks to bring a product to market through their own efforts. But the one thing that I really think that Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith has to take into account is that right from the get-go, David gave up a very healthy lifestyle, very healthy income with ING Bank, where he was on the payroll in Belgium, to get into this venture. And initially it was his own personal funding that got the venture off the ground. He pulled a team of people together and was making headway. And perhaps it was his desire to get into the NHS, maybe to run before he was walking, that was his ultimate downfall. So, certainly my thoughts and prayers and visualizations are with David and Lorraine over the course of the weekend. But whatever the determination of Justice Nicholas Lorraine Smith on Tuesday, this is now in the public domain. GcMAF is in a much wider vocabulary than it was even just a week ago. And now we have an opportunity, we the collective we communities right across the country have an opportunity to start questioning what the cancer charities are really doing. Who's really driving what happens within the cancer charities? And what is the role of Big Pharma in what is effectively antitrust and shutting down any competitive product, particularly one that comes from a small company or indeed someone who brings it to market with entrepreneurial spirit. So there you go. It's been a long week. Joining the realms of the commuters hasn't exactly been my ideal way of spending the week, but I'm so glad that I was here. I'm so glad I've seen things unfold, and I'm obviously going to be following this very, very closely. I'm going to be getting hourly reports basically from the courts on Monday and Tuesday, and I will be doing 8:30 a.m. broadcasts on Monday, Tuesday, and certainly Wednesday of next week, although not in the evening. And as I said earlier this morning, please, if you want to get further insight into how literally we in the UK are being held by the corporatocracy, and whether people want to realize it or not, this is a democracy that is held to ransom by the corporatocracy, and this is just one example of that. But out of every problem, out of every challenge, comes an opportunity. So you have a great weekend, and I'll catch with you on Monday morning at 8:30 from a much more picturesque scenario than here on the banks of the south bank of the Thames. You take care now.